Okay, let me just tell you some things. I'm a technical person in the physical sciences, and like most of you people. And I just want to tell you some of the things that I learned in my 15 years as an amateur beekeeper. Because I'm a physical scientist, I've had very little training in biology. My last biology course was in high school, and that was at the same time that Crick and Watson were doing their thing. So I'm really, some of you people probably may know more about what I'm talking about than I do myself. And if so, if I make some mistakes, please join in and tell me where I'm making my mistakes, or if you want to add something. Now, what I'm going to talk about are honeybees. And we all know what they look like, although we make mistakes as to what is a honeybee and what is something else. They belong to something called an order called Hymenoptera. And that are bees, wasps, ants, and sawflies, whatever sawflies happen to be. They are not related to termites, as more related to ants. Now, one of the important things that I have to tell you what a honeybee is not. A honeybee is not a yellow jacket. A lot of people make this mistake, and almost every fall, I would get a call from somebody saying, your bees are in my house. And it was much, which was ridiculous because it's a time when the yellow jackets go in. Yellow jackets are wasps, by the way, and so are paper wasps. Bumblebees are bees. And you can notice that there's quite a difference. Wasps look like wasps. They have this elongated structure, which bees don't usually have. I always almost have to say usually, because whatever I say, there's often exceptions. Bumblebees, honeybees are the ones that are the only ones in this country which are domesticated, except for bumblebees sometimes are kept in glass houses for pollination. Now, you can make all sorts of mistakes as to what a bee is. Is that a bee? What do you guys think?
Yellow jacket.
Anybody other?
I think it might be a fly, yeah.
That's a fly. That's called a robber fly. It's very common in this area. It's quite small. Notice it has two wings. Flies have two wings. Most other insects have four wings. Is that a bee? That's very common in this area too. That's known as a sweatfly. And you'll notice that it has four wings, although the fore and the hind wings are connected together with sort of a Velcro type of connection. This does, by the way, this does not sting, this bee. Or at least if it stings, it can't penetrate your skin. There's all sorts of bees in North America, and they're all different sizes. The honeybee is over here, and you can see that there's some very small ones and some very large ones. Most of those are not capable of stinging a human. Now, by the way, bees are primarily drink nectar from flowers. Wasps are mostly carnivorous, although they do also come to flowers and get sweet. Beekeeping is very, very old. Some of it was, here you have a picture from a cave in 6000 BC. And in Spain, you'll notice that he is gathering the bees, gathering it from a wild hive, from a feral bees. Feral bees are almost extinct right now in the United States. They exist, but feral bees cannot exist very well in the United States, mainly because of some parasites that attack bees, and you really need human protection against these parasites. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The old-fashioned type of hive that we have is called the skep, usually made out of some woven material, straw or cloth. It's actually illegal in Massachusetts because it's hard to examine for diseases and parasites. Massachusetts, along with a lot of other states and provinces, has a law that says that you must allow your hive to be inspected by the state. And they're inspecting it for disease and for parasites. If they find it, they can compel you to correct the problem. And in certain cases, they can even tell you to destroy your hive. Bees are considered an agricultural animal and therefore regulated by the state. The state would come to my hive about once a year, and they would inspect it. They would take it apart and examine it, and they would often provide some very useful information for me. Well, there's a skep. It's right on the flag of the state of Utah. But of course, it's supposed to be because bees are industrious, but bees have a certain position in Mormon theology. Now, the modern hive was developed by a man by the name of Langstroth. He was a minister, a congregational minister. He was even a minister at the South Church in Andover. And he developed this hive, which is the standard hive today. It has movable frames, as you can see in here. This is typically what a modern hive looks like, and almost all Western hives look like this. You have a brood chamber where this is most with the queen resides here. The babies are brought up here. There is some honey storage, and then you have super, and there could be more than one super. The supers are where the honey is stored. What you have here is a screen called a queen excluder. What this does is prevent the queen from going up into the super and laying eggs. So all the reproduction takes place in the brood. Now there's three kinds of bees that you'll find in the hive. Two of them are female and one is male. The queen and the workers are all females. Ordinarily, there's only one queen. And then you have the drones. Notice the great big eyes. These guys can sting. This guy cannot. The guys cannot sting. They do not have a stinger. They're almost hopeless creatures. They can't feed themselves. All they can do is really mate. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. The queen and the worker are both female. Almost any time you see a bee outside of the hive, you'll rarely see a drone. Unless you take apart hives, you'll never see a drone. Now, according to Cole Porter, bees do it. They really do. It's called a nuptial flight. And what happens is that a virgin queen leaves the hive, flies at about 20 or 30 meters in the air, and flies into a congregation of males, of drones, who are there to mate with her. They will typically mate. She'll mate about a dozen or two times, and she will accumulate the sperm in a special organ called a spermatheca, which will keep them for as long as she lives, which could be about 5 or 6 years. The sperm are viable during that entire time. Now, what happens is that the drone will come in and mate. And during the mating process, I understand there's a visible pop when it takes place. And he will leave his copulatory organ, known as a pseudophallus, in her. And he will drop off. And he will die very soon after that. The next bee will come along, the next drone will come along, will knock the pseudophallus out of the queen and insert his own. And the process goes on and on and on. This is the only time that that queen will ever mate. She will get all the sperm that she needs during this nuptial flight. Sex determination, it works very differently than in humans. There's none of these X and Y chromosomes. What happens is if the queen combines the egg and a sperm together, you'll get a female, which of course can either become a worker or a queen. If she does not, then it's a virgin birth and it becomes a drone. In other words, the males are haploid. They only have one chromosome. The females have 2 chromosomes like us. So they're very, very different. This is not unusual, by the way, in the invertebrate world. The various types of sexual reproduction that take place in insects is extremely varied and defies the imagination of the kinkiest of any of us. This word parthenogenesis is virgin birth. It's a Greek word. It's actually used in theology. And the other thing to realize that the females do have a mother and father. The male only has grandparents genetically. Now, what good are the males? They're about 10% of the hive during the spring and summer. And what do they exist for? They exist for the same reason that males exist among humans. number one, to mate, number two, to make females happy. It's found that if you remove all the males from the hive, the production of honey goes way down, the activity goes way down, and things aren't working right. Bees communicate mostly by chemical means. They're called pheromones that they produce, and that's mostly how they communicate with one another. Apparently, the males are giving off a particular hormone, a particular pheromone that keeps things working right. They cannot feed themselves. They have to be fed by their sisters. They don't work. They have no stingers. They can't defend the hive. In fact, one of the gross things that beekeepers often do to impress non-beekeepers is to pick up a drone and put it in their lips. They can only mate with the queen from another hive. If they do mate with the queen from another hive, the sperm are not viable. Does anyone have any questions, by the way, so far?
You mentioned that the queen flies a fairly short distance.
Well, I have to increase my volume. What is it, John?
You said that the queen flies a fairly short distance, I thought, to find the drones. I didn't realize that there were enough hives within 100 yards or whatever.
Oh, no, it's not 100 yards. They're flying up in the air at an altitude of about 20 or 30 meters.
But they're flying a much greater distance.
Yeah, but the drones seem to congregate in one place from different hives, and they come from probably about a mile radius. Any other questions?
So
Yes.
Howard, you mentioned
It's
that
the
the state inspected your hives about once a year. Do you have to register the hives with the state, or how do they find out about you?
I'm required to register. It's very laxly. There are penalties for not doing it, but the state really, it's fairly easy to avoid this, but it's really to your advantage to register it.
Howard, are the major differences between these three bees physical size, among other things?
There's size, as you can see, and the drone has these huge eyes and is much wider and stronger.
Thank you.
You can mainly see the drone by its big bug eyes. How is the queen produced, by the way? How do you make a queen out of an egg, and sometimes it becomes a worker? And what happens is that when an egg is laid, a female egg is laid, some of those eggs will be removed by the worker, taken to another cell, which is much larger, and it will be fed almost exclusively a substance called royal jelly. This is something that is produced by all workers. And all bees get a little bit of royal jelly, but the queen gets a lot of it. The larva of the this changes the genetics of the bees. This is a very interesting problem in epigenetics, which somebody may someday want to talk about, where you can change the genetics by changing the environment, and produces something very, very different, which is the queen. The queen is the only one who can lay eggs, the only female that can lay eggs. The workers are infertile females. Now, something happens very interesting in the autumn, and this is where all the sisters massacre their brothers. There's no mating in the winter, therefore there's no need for males. You can produce a male for any time you want by just taking an egg and not fertilizing it. So you can always, in the spring, build up on the males. You don't want to waste food on males during the winter. So the sisters kill their brothers. And this is really a dramatic thing. What happens in the autumn on one particular day, what will happen is that the bees will start attacking their brothers, and they will bite off their legs, they will sting them, bite off their heads, and they will push them out of the hive, and they will fall down onto the ground, and there will be a big pile of males there, usually with a bunch of yellow jackets enjoying the feasting on these dead and dying drones. Something that you will see quite ordinarily is a swarm. One of the most exciting things is a time when a swarm forms. What happens is usually in the spring, a hive divides. This is the way that hives reproduce each other. In other words, one hive becomes two hives. And what happens is that a queen leaves and brings about half of the hive with her. What happens eventually, what you see initially is a bunch of bees coming out of the hive, like this left picture. The bees are flying everywhere. They're going completely berserk. It's enough to drive you crazy. There's a huge roar like a jet engine. And you see the bees flying all over the place. They're bumping into you. They're bumping into walls. They're doing everything. And within a few minutes, they collect in one place, the side of a building on a branch, and there'll be a queen in the center of it, and then all the other queens, the other workers will congregate around it, and it will remain there for a couple days. This is the time, by the way, the bees generally do not sting during this time. They're full of honey. There's no babies around to signal that they should be defended. They're very docile. This is the time, if you've ever seen pictures of a beekeeper with a bee beard, where he will actually put a queen under his neck, and then all the bees will form a swarm underneath his neck, and he probably will not be stung. Whenever you see a swarm, don't worry about it. The bees are very gentle at that particular time. Now, one of the fascinating things that happens at that time is the bees then will send out scouts, and the scouts will fly around and try to find a permanent home for them. If they can't find it within a few days, then this swarm will die. If they do find it, then they will go to that hive. The method of deciding between competitive potential hives is very interesting. It's done on a method of consensus. Some recent experiments that have been taking place elucidate this, and it's absolutely fascinating how they do it. There's a book on this called Bee Democracy. By the way, the queen has no decision-making process. She's not really a queen. She's really an egg-laying slave. She's an egg-laying machine. She lays about her own weight in eggs every day. And she is attended by her by the workers. If the workers perceive that she's not doing her job, she isn't producing well enough, or she doesn't smell the right way, or anything like that, they will kill her and they will produce a new queen, and in order to keep the hive going. The development of the bee, well, the queen lays an egg, a larva forms, then a pupa, and then a new adult, which could be any of the three types would come out. Notice the metamorphosis is almost the same as in a caterpillar, or a moth. In other words, an egg, a larva or caterpillar, a pupa or a cocoon, and then the adult. You can see some larvae in these cells, and you can see a worker bee tending to the babies, feeding them. Here, a cell has been sealed because there is a pupa in there. Then the pupa will break that out, and then it'll come out an adult. Now, the worker goes through several stages. The first job that it has is usually being a nursemaid. And one of the reasons is because it is producing royal jelly at that particular time. And it will also be a comb builder because it is producing beeswax, which is used to build the comb. During this time, they can take on all sorts of jobs. They can become a janitor or an undertaker. In other words, removing dead bees, removing filth from the hive, keeping it clean. They can receive the pollen and nectar, or they can be a soldier to defend the hive. There's two types of food that bees generally have.
Who are they defending it from? I mean, other than Winnie the Pooh, who I knew went after.
They can defend it from Winnie the Pooh. They can defend it from you. They can defend it from lots of things that we will discuss later, okay? Be patient. They eat pollen and nectar. Nectar is where they get their carbohydrates. Pollen is where they get their protein. The bee has what's called a pollen basket on their hind legs. And the pollen will collect there and they will bring it in. They also pick up other things like water. They also pick up sometimes rosin from trees, which they will use for sealing cracks. The last thing that they do in life is become a forager. And that means that's where they go out and they get the pollen and the nectar. And they will, that's the hardest work. That's where they will generally work themselves to death. You can always see a dead bee that's overworked and ready to die. their wings will be sort of crinkled, and they look old. By being a receiver and processor of pollen and nectar, what they're also doing is producing honey. In other words, they are taking the pollen, mixing it with an enzyme in their body, and then they're regurgitating it, and then they heat it up and evaporate much of the water, and that is what honey is.
So you mentioned, Howard, the male drone doesn't last less than a year. How long do the females last?
Okay. During the summer when they're working, don't forget, a bee works itself to death. A worker bee works itself to death. So during the summer when things are very, very active, they may last about 6 weeks. Those that overwinter will last over the winter. Now, how do they live during the winter? This is the honeybee is the only insect that we know of that behaves this way during the winter. In other words, the queen is in the center, stays in the center, and all the other bees cluster around her and keep her warm. And the ones on the inside go onto the on the outside go onto the inside, and all those on the inside go on the outside, and they sort of rotate. How are they keeping her warm? They're eating honey. And that's the reason why bees store honey. They store honey so that they can stay warm during the winter. The bee dance. This is how a bee communicates. When a scout goes out and finds some flowers that can provide food, he has to communicate that with the rest of the bees and tell them how it's done. And generally he does it by what's known as a waggle dance. He will dance in this in this sort of figure 8 way. It will he does it based on the orientation between the top of the hive and the direction he's doing it, which has the same relationship to the sun at that particular time. And he will, the amount of wiggling he does, the rate of wiggling that he does tells how far away it happens to be. And there's still research going on trying to figure out what all the nuances of this happen to be. Actually, once he tells it the direction it happens to be, then the bees can figure out as the sun moves. And they seem to be able to calculate the position of the food pack relative to the moving sun. The bees, by the
is that affected by weather? In other words, do they have to physically see the sun, or if there are clouds and rain and whatever, do they still operate?
Okay, bees don't work very well during the rain because it hinders their flying. But bees see a different spectra than we do, so they can see through the clouds, and they can find out where the sun happens to be.
Is this the he or the she is doing this?
This is the she. Only she's are interested. He's are hopeless. They're less like us guys.
Because you said he was doing the wiggling and the waggling.
Yeah, it's a she. Sorry. This was discovered by a guy by the name of Lawrence, I think in the 20s or 30s, and he got the Nobel Prize for this. Unfortunately, he also was a Nazi.
Are the combs always vertical? I mean, if they're horizontal, what is the upwards?
They were always horizontal.
So upwards in this context then on the comb means what if it's horizontal?
If it's horizontal, in other words, the frame of reference up is the direction to the sun. The other direction is the direction of the dance shows you where the flower is relative to that sun.
Well, isn't there a problem here of what we mean by horizontal? I mean, do you mean that the tube runs horizontal?
No, I mean, excuse me, I should say vertical. Vertical.
Okay.
Vertical upwards is the reference structure.
But the frames go vertically into the hive. We could see that earlier. That's
right.
And the tubes of the wax go horizontally, don't they, in the frame?
Yes. So there's a lot we don't understand about this, but, and there's still a lot of research going around about this. Apparently there's some communication through the sounds that bee is making, which we don't understand yet, but basically he is showing the direction relative to the sun.
Do they also communicate distance?
Yes, it seems to be by the frequency of his wiggle, how he wiggles his butt.
Did Von Frisch have any contribution to the interpretation of the dance?
I wouldn't know.
Von Frisch?
I don't know.
Okay. I thought he got the Nobel Prize also, but sometime later than the person that you talked about. The one I'm thinking of is the 1960s.
Yeah, this was I think, quite a bit earlier.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about killer bees. Remember this from Saturday Night Live? This is actually quite sad. It shows Bellucci and Ratner. There was quite a bit of fuss about the killer bees coming up from South America into the United States and causing a lot of disruption. What these killer bees were actually, we like to call them, beekeepers usually call them Africanized bees. They look like ordinary bees. They're almost exactly like it. In fact, it takes an expert really to tell the difference. And sometimes to really know, you have to do a dissection under a microscope and sometimes do a DNA analysis. They were bees. They look just like European bees. Maybe I should have told you before that bees are not native to the Western Hemisphere. They come from the Eastern Hemisphere. They were thought to have evolved probably somewhere around the Caucasus Mountains. They did not, they're an invasive species. They came over with the settlers from Europe. So they did not do very well in the jungles of South America. And there were some bees in Africa, in the African jungle, that seemed to do much better than European bees. They were much more defensive. They were much more aggressive in protecting themselves in the dangerous environment of the jungle, in the very hot, humid weather. Some scientists in Brazil decided to bring them over to Brazil and experiment on them and see if they could make a honeybee that would work very well in the Brazilian jungle. These bees turned out very much like European bees. They look like European bees. They have the same sting. The thing about them is they're much more defensive they have a much lower threshold for deciding when they have to be defensive. In other words, a much lower threat will set them off, and they will attack in much larger numbers, and they will pursue their presumed enemy for much longer distances. They also have a greater tendency to swarm and also abscond, which means leave the hive and form a new hive. The big problem is that the Africanized genes are dominant. So if an African male mates with a female European or female European queen, what happens is all the offspring are now going to become Africanized. And this is the big problem. In other words, they were hoping that the Africanized genes would become more recessive, and that they would be that the European bee genes would make them less defensive. It turned the opposite way around. They escaped and started moving north. They were introduced in 1957. They moved at about 200 miles a year north. They reached Brownville, Texas in 1990. People were killed. Animals were killed. People, and animals that couldn't get away fast enough. This is still happening. They colonized most of the southern part of the United States, west of the Mississippi, and it was thought that they would never be able to broach the Mississippi. Unfortunately, what's happened is that they entered through the port of Tampa and through the port of Mobile, and so they're now in the eastern part of the United States as well. Here's how they moved. Now, this is the likely range that they will reach, assuming that there's no more genetic changes and that climate change doesn't take place. The main thing that keeps them from getting into this is completely out of date, so really look at the gray part. The thing that mainly will keep them out of the northern, from coming up to Massachusetts, is the length of our winter. So pray that there isn't a lot of climate change. The thing that keeps them from coming up here is the length of our winter. The Africanized bees do not, store enough honey to winter in our part of the country. So they will probably be limited to somewhere around Philadelphia or Baltimore. On the East Coast, probably about St. Louis in the middle part of the country. And where it's much milder on the West Coast, they'll probably get up into Vancouver. Now, let me show you this, Bob or Steve, whoever has it. Can you, Hollywood decided to warn us about this whole thing as in their public spirit. So I'd like you to see this so that this warning that they put out in a commercial film. Can you show it, please, whoever has it?
Steve, do you have the video?
I can get to it, I believe.
Okay, should I get out of my, do I have to do anything? Unshare my screen?
We can take care of that.
Okay, there.
And now I gotta find out how I can share this.
Any questions in the meantime?
Yeah, I have one. Are bees territorial? That is, do they defend their own hive against other hives?
Yes, they do, and they will raid each other's hive as well.
You mentioned that they produce less honey for the winter. Do they produce overall less honey and therefore not as good product to have around?
No, during the winter, there's no flowers around, so they don't produce honey.
But I mean, if they manage to displace all the current normal bees, are we better off or are we worse off, other than the potential of stinging us and killing us or animals?
They have changed the ecology tremendously in this country by being competitive with other bees.
So do the Africanized bees overall produce less honey?
I'll get to that, but well, let me just tell you, okay, they were a success they were a tremendous success in Brazil. Now Brazil is a major producer of honey. The amount of honey going up in Brazil is about 10 times what it was before. But it did produce, the beekeepers had to learn to adapt to its behavior. And of course, there were people and animals that were killed by these bees and still are.
For more than 20 years, scientists have known that a swarm of killer bees has been headed towards the United States. Now, Warner Brothers presents Irwin Allen's The Swarm.
We have visual contact.
Identify.
A black mass, sir. A moving black mass.
We have been invaded by an enemy far more lethal than any human force.
Starring Michael Caine, Catherine Ross, Richard Widmark, Richard Chamberlain, Olivia de Havilland, Ben Johnson, Lee Grant, Jose Ferrer, Patty Duke Aston, Slim Pickens, Bradford Dillman, Fred McMurray, and Henry Fonda.
Get inside! I need everybody get inside! Quickly get inside!
A story of courage and sacrifice.
Newman! Go for it! Go! Move out!
Not since the 30s, when families by the thousands fled the Oklahoma Dust Bowl, has a thriving American community had to be totally evacuated, until today.
Its size is immeasurable. Its power is limitless. Its enemy is man.
The war that I've always talked about has finally started.
Mile by mile, city by city, it moves, leaving in its wake a path of destruction.
For God's sake, Crane, when are we going to stop this massacre?
Irwin Allen's The Swarm. It is more than speculation. It is a prediction. The swarm is coming.
Does that put you at ease? I bet you can't wait to see that. Now, by the way, I was terribly surprised to see Henry Fonda in there. They must have paid him a lot of money because he is a beekeeper, or was a beekeeper.
They have a fairly classy cast.
It must have cost him a fortune, that cast. I mean, and by the way, the only one who was stung during that production was Olivia de Havilland, and she survived.
Henry Fonda's wife, Henry Fonda's son got an Oscar in his movie about bees.
Yes, I was going to bring that up. If you want to see a fantastic movie, it's not only of a beekeeper, but also it's a wonderful drama, and it's called Yuli's Gold. Yuli, short for Ulysses. And it's about a beekeeper, a very small commercial beekeeper in the Florida Panhandle. And you'll see a lot of things, how beekeepers work. You'll see him working the bees in his bare arms. You'll see him capturing a hive. You'll see him a swarm. You'll see him harvesting the honey. And it's a very good drama as well. Okay, how do I get back to my screen? Now, how do I get, Steve, Bob, how do I get back to where I want to be? To my,
Like you did at the beginning.
okay. In other words, what I have to do is share screen again. You'll excuse me, this is the first time that I have given a talk on Zoom.
You're back. You're back.
Yeah, I can see that.
That's familiar.
For some reason, okay. Generally around here, you don't have to worry about the African honeybees around here. They are, and if you go down south, you don't really have to worry about them very much, because the beekeepers around there are using management techniques that keep the African bees out of their hives. One of the things they do is something that I did when I was a beekeeper, and that is I bought queens that have been artificially inseminated. So they didn't have to go through this arbitrary method of copulation in order to get the proper genes. By the way, I could order the queens with the insemination that has the genes that I was particularly interested in, for things like disease resistance, for things like early buildup of honey, for their temperament, and for overwintering ability.
Where do you get these from?
I buy them. Yeah, I would buy them from a place in Texas. They would mail them to me. The queen would come in a little cage with some attendants with her, and I would introduce it into a new hive. I would also buy my bees from Texas, and they would send them in a wire basket with a queen in there. I would get a phone call about 4 in.the morning from the Lexington post office saying, "Hey, come and get your bees right now." What would happen is that when they dump the bees into the hive, into this little wire basket, what would happen is not all the bees would get into the hive, but they would still, some of the bees would be on the outside, but they would still smell the queen. So it would go through the mail, and there would be bees on, there would be maybe a dozen bees on the outside, and 3 pounds of bees on the inside, something like, which would be about 25,000 bees. And they would get a little nervous about it. This is something that I show when I give the talk in the South. And that is that you're not worried really about the commercial keeper or the keepers who actually have hives, but you're worried about the feral hives, which might be Africanized. So you might be worried about going around where there's abandoned vehicles or lumber piles, things like that, where there might be an Africanized hive there. The stinger. A bee has a honeybee has barbs on its stinger. In other words, the barb stays in you. And when it stings you, part of it comes out and it loses part of its, some vital parts. It stays in you. Generally what happens, this is by the true only for bees. It's not true for wasps, for yellow jackets, anything like that. The yellow jacket can sting you as many times as it wants. A honeybee can only sting you once because it leaves the stinger in, and you'll see some black things connected to it on the end. Those are some vital parts to it, but it also contains the poison sac, and which will continue injecting into you. Your job is to get that out of you as quickly as possible, because the longer it's in there, the more poison it injects into you. The thing that you should not do is grab it by by the bulbous thing that's sticking out and pull on it. You should scrape it off. Use your fingernail, a credit card, a knife, or something like that, and scrape it off from the side. The poison that it injects is very uncomfortable. And for most people, it is not very toxic. Generally, for a systemic reaction to bees, you have to have 100 or more stings at one time. Some people are allergic to bees. And of course, they need treatment. They have to worry about anaphylactic shock, and they should be shot with an EpiPen and may need some medical attention. Wasps and bees have different toxins in them. And it's very unusual for a person to be both allergic to both bees and wasps. Something like about 1.5% of the population is allergic to bees, and about 1.5% is allergic to wasp stings. Any questions there? How not?
I've heard this term anaphylactic shock, all my life, but what is it? What is anaphylactic?
Okay, is there a physician here? I'll try and say it then. What happens is that there's a reaction somewhere in your throat or in your trachea or something like that, which causes you to have trouble breathing. For a better discussion of it, talk to somebody who knows what they're saying.
That's the end result of a massive increase in histamine. It's sort of similar to a cytokine storm. And
well, it
isn't
a cytokine storm.
No, it's a different type of reaction.
What happens is you have a disseminated reaction of histamine and other proteins that cause vasodilatation. So your blood pressure collapses, and that's what anaphylaxis is.
Okay, so that's fundamentally different from the cytokine storm that has been described.
Anaphylaxis occurs acutely.
Okay.
Okay, how not to get stung. Okay, number one, bees generally are very docile, except when they are defending their hive. And what happens is that the babies give off pheromones that say, protect me. And if they think that something's going to attack their babies, they react appropriately. If a bee lands on you, this lady over here is not terribly worried about it. The bee will probably, it's away from the hive. It's not terribly worried as long as you don't squish it or provoke it in some way. You probably will not get stung. Don't make any fast movements. Just let it sit there, and maybe if you can gently brush it away, maybe, but just be gentle. It really doesn't want to sting you, and don't forget it will die if it stings you. Don't wear scents, because the scents attract bees. In other words, colognes and perfumes. And some of these perfumes and colognes have chemicals in them that mimic the attack pheromones. Wear lightly colored clothes. Bees are attracted by bright colors. If you have curly hair, a bee might get entrapped in it. You go over there to scratch or to something and you squish it and it stings you. So if you have curly hair, wear a hat. Avoid baggy openings to clothing. They can crawl underneath your clothing, and you feel something itch and you squish it and you get hung. Stay away from feral hives. When you approach a hive, don't come straight at it from the front. Come from the side or the back. And sometimes they can be set off by strong vibrations, such as your lawnmower or your leaf blower. If you're attacked, get away. Run away fast. The farther you can get away from the hive, the better.
Howard, what's the difference between a feral hive and I guess a domestic hive? Is that the other hive?
Okay. A feral hive is a hive that is in the wild. A domestic hive is one that's maintained by a person in something like a Langstroth hive.
I've also heard that carbon dioxide can set them off, so heavy breathing will intensify what they're going to do to you.
It's a new one to me.
Okay.
Pollination. This is very important. 15% of our diet is dependent on insect pollination. That's fruits, vegetables, legumes, herbs. About the only thing are things like wheat and corn that are pollinated in the air. One of the main reason that we need bees for pollination, honeybees for pollination, is because of monoculture. In other words, what happens is we produce huge fields of one particular type of plant, and therefore it only blooms for a short amount of time. What happens is that if you have a diversity of, like in a wild area, a diversity of plants, they all bloom at different times. So the bees can always go find flowers in order to get food. But if you have a monoculture that only blooms for maybe 2 weeks of the entire year, what are they going to do for the rest of the year? So therefore, we need bees that we can carry from one place to another in order to provide pollination. Now, also because of land use and pesticides, we kill the natural bees that do pollination as well. Consequently, we have the commercial bee pollination business. These are commercial companies, some of them extremely large, that go from farm to farm and rent their bees. In fact, beekeepers generally, these type of beekeepers generally make more money from renting bees than they do from honey. The commercial, they write contracts with the farmer, saying, specifying certain things like how much honey, how much their pesticide use. They might also specify that there be a certain amount of bee activity, so many bees leaving and coming into the hive per minute. A beekeeper may prepare his field prior to it. For instance, in the apple orchards around here, generally they will mow the under the trees prior to pollination, so that there's no competition between the apple blossoms and the dandelions. Bees prefer dandelions, by the way. All sorts of pollinators take place. There was a very interesting, very nice, here's a bee that has a lot of pollen stuck to it, which it will carry from flower to flower. All sorts of animals do pollination. This is from some stamps that the US Post Office issued a couple of years ago. You'll see bumblebees, you'll see hummingbirds, you'll see, they all pollinate. These are all natural pollinators. Butterflies. I might even mention that mosquitoes are very good pollinators.
Howard,
Yes.
you mentioned bumblebees, and you've also been talking about honeybees. They look very different. Are they different species?
They are different species. Bumblebees are a species, a genus called Bombus. And honeybees are a particular type called Apis mellifera, which in Latin means honeybee. They're both Hymenoptera, and they're closely related, but they look differently, and they have different bumblebees usually have are underground, have their nests underground, and Apis mellifera honeybees have it above ground.
Do both produce honey?
Yeah, but you can't, it's hard to, you can't, bumblebees, the honey is hard to harvest. So they're generally not kept for that. They're kept for making honey. They're kept for pollination. And that's usually where they do it is in glass houses.
So, yeah, also I think basically the bumblebee nest dies out in the winter. Only the queen and a couple of other bees survive the winter, and then they rebuild in the spring. So they don't need a big store of honey.
That's right. And the way they do it is, and bumblebees' hives are fairly small compared to honeybees. Honeybees generally during the winter can have maybe about 50,000 bees in them. A lot less during maybe about 10,000 during the winter. Commercial beekeepers, this is what you're liable to see, a flatbed truck with a bunch of hives on it. He's got a front loader.
When that baby crashes, you must have a spectacle.
Absolutely. If I were a commercial beekeeper, and what I'm talking about is maybe about 20 years ago, I don't know what it is now. If I were renting my hive over to some farmers in the apple orchards east of here, or west of here, I'd get about $20 or $30 for 2 weeks. if I were renting to, now they're very hard up for bees, particularly in the almond orchards in California, in Northern California. And I would get maybe about $200 or $300 for 2 weeks up there. So a lot of beekeepers can bring their hives up to California in the spring. It's a cutthroat situation. There's even rampant crime in bee rustlers and the stealing each other's hives, which is a big problem up there. Quite a few years ago, there was an accident in which one of these trucks turned over. Something like about $500,000 worth of bees and bee equipment was destroyed. It took place up in Maine, and they lost about $10 million worth of the blueberry crop up in Maine. These beekeepers generally start, they're migrants. They generally start up in Florida. They go to the peach orchards and in Georgia, and usually end up in the blueberries up in Maine, or the buckwheat in the Midwest. Now, one of the things that has taken place in recent years among amateurs is urban beekeeping. And as you can see, this is in Manhattan. Here's up on the Charles River. People keeping bees. Beekeeping even on rooftops and balconies is taking place a lot in urban areas. Until about 30 years ago, it was illegal in Manhattan. Now it's legal, and a lot of people are doing it. Around here, you'll find on the third floor of the Bedford Library, you'll find a hive. On the rooftop of the Four Seasons Hotel in Boston, there's a hive, or quite a few hives. Until the fire at the Cathedral of Notre Dame, on their roofs, they kept bees.
By the way, Howard, on the previous photos, all of those boxes have different colors. Is there a color coding somehow for the pollen or the flower they service, or what is that for?
Are you talking about the color of the colors of honey?
Of the beehive boxes that were loaded on the truck.
Oh, the color of, no, a beehive, it can be any color. Those are probably, they may have gotten them from different places. That may be their own identification. I don't know.
I was wondering whether that was similar to a cattle brand, whether they're identifying their own hives.
Generally, they'll burn that in, like a burn. They'll often write it some way in some indelible way. Usually burning it in with a brand. The color of honey, by the way, is decided by and the flavor of the honey is decided by the flower itself, not by the bees. So when I kept hives in Lexington, I lived fairly close to a swamp, and my honey was sort of an orange color, not orange, but a purple color because of purple loosestrife that grew near me. But the flavor is determined by the color, by the particular flower. You can buy orange honey, you can buy clover honey. Out in the West Coast, you can buy poison oak honey, which I understand the bees actually remove the poison oak toxin, and that it's quite good.
So how is the flavor of purple loosestrife? honey.
Oh, it's good. It's very good. Of course, the purple loosestrife is a noxious plant.
A noxious weed.
Yeah. Here you see that how much we rely on bees. The bigger the dark one, the more we are dependent on honeybees, on Apis mellifera. Anything, other insects are, for other crops, we're less dependent. So you'll notice that almonds, almost all of it, almost all the blueberries have to be pollinated by honeybees. And the farmers have to pay for renting them.
Is there any natural bee population around Lexington? I asked because my daughter has a little apple tree that last year bloomed copiously, and I never saw a single bee around it.
You could have, yeah, there's natural ways there's other natural pollinators. So they could be it could be butterflies, it could be bumblebees, it could be mosquitoes. It could be.
Well, she didn't get many apples. She just had a lot of blossoms. That's why I was wondering.
Yeah. Okay. Well, once you have the blossoms, then you need to pollinate them. Yeah. Something has to pollinate. In fact, I've seen pictures in China. Parts of China have such a deficit of pollinators that they're pollinating by hand. They're pollinating fruit trees by hand. Of course, they have cheap labor there, and people go around with little brushes and brush the blossoms and take it from one flower to another.
Well, I tried that, but I was not nearly as good as a bee would be.
You probably aren't. But
you're a professor. Mostly you have you're a professor, Charlie. Mostly you have a stinger.
What is,
Jerry, you're the one with a stinger.
Charlie, you're not as highly evolved.
Many people have told me that.
Okay, let's talk about things that problems that bees have. Other animals eat bees. Here, for instance, a spider is about to enjoy a honeybee. By the way, you'll notice that this honeybee has collected some pollen in his pollen basket, but that didn't help him. He's going to be spider meat. Enemies of honeybees. Okay, somebody mentioned Winnie. Now, one thing that you have to, one of the problems that you have is that you've been misled. Winnie is primarily not interested in the honey. He's interested in the larva. He wants that protein. He'll eat the honey, but he really enjoys the larva. By the way, bears are a problem around here. Is somebody saying something? I can't understand. Bears are a problem around here. I have a friend who keeps bees, and she's has a place near the VA hospital, and she has had to put electrified wire around the hive to keep bears away.
So my daughter does this. She also keeps bees, and she lives out on Hancock. But apparently you have to coat the wire with bacon fat in order to get the bear to touch it with his nose. Otherwise, a bear just walks through your fence and chows down.
That's right. And if you watch Yuli's Gold, you'll see what happens when a bear attacks honey hives. There's all sorts of diseases, bacterial, fungal, and protozoan, viral diseases they have the same problem as us. They live in an area, a very tight community with with 50,000 of their relatives there. It's very hot and humid in there. It's a wonderful place for all sorts of diseases. They have parasites, particularly mites. These two mites are a disaster. They've come over from Asia. It's probably about 40 or 50 years ago. The Asian bees have been fairly good at protecting themselves against the mite. The bees around here have never really developed very good protections against them. They really require human intervention. There are poisons that we use, but it's very hard to use a poison because the mites, being arachnids, being arthropods, are very closely related to bees, and it's like finding a poison that works on mice but doesn't work on people. Predators, birds, they love them. They like to eat them. Raccoons, skunks. Skunks will come over and they will scratch the front of the hive and they'll eat the live bees. They love live bees. They got stung in their palate and everything like that. They love it anyway. It's probably like us eating hot chili. Wasps. I mentioned that the spiders, wax moths, small beetles, they all create problems. And of course, man changing the environment, giving them pesticides. They live a very nasty life.
But what is hive collapse disorder?
Okay, I was going to get to that. Hive collapse disorder is thought to be a viral disease. It's also perhaps related to pesticides. In Europe, they are forbidding a particular type of pesticide called the nicotinamides. They're forbidden in the European Union. They are not forbidden here. There's a disagreement between the Department of Agriculture here and the Department of Agriculture in Europe. They may be a factor, but there seems to be also possibility that it could be a virus as well. They're doing much better in Europe than we are. We're much more reluctant to not to not ban pesticides. It may be a combination of a viral problem and a pesticide problem. Perhaps they have to work together. I don't know. What happens is, by the way, that bees leave the hive and become disoriented and do not come back. And so then all the foragers leave the hive, don't come back, and the rest of the hive dies from hunger. One of the things bees do is that often a sick bee will leave the hive and not come back in order not to infect the rest of the hive. Is somebody talking to me, a woman's voice? There's a woman's voice. Is there a woman trying to talk to me? Because I couldn't understand.
I think somebody else is unmuted and there's a woman talking in the background.
Okay, I want you to meet my colleagues. Henry Fonda and his son, Peter Fonda. If you watch Ulee's Gold, you'll see how comfortable he is with the bees. Here's a surprise, Scarlett Johansson. Morgan Freeman, Martha Stewart, Sylvia Plath, Leon Tolstoy, Maria von Trapp, and of course, Edmund Hillary was a commercial beekeeper. I've recently also learned that Prince Charles has been a beekeeper as well. And of course, as John has pointed out, the most famous of them all, any questions? The end.
Well, Howard, thank you very, very much.
That was very
You
fine,
can
very
all
fine.
unmute
Thank you.
yourselves.
Yeah, that was great. That was really
Thank you.
good. Very nice.
Well, thank you very much.
Excellent job.
Excellent, excellent, Howard.
Thank you.
Yeah, Howard, a question. Could I tell the difference in the honey that comes from the African bee as opposed to the European bee, or or something that was more domestic here?
No. And except that the answer is no. If they're coming from the same flower, it's the flower that determines.
Howard, you and I actually talked about this yesterday, but maybe you can answer it for others. I was told by a friend of mine who is a beekeeper in Chelmsford that if I had a spoonful of his local honey every day, my allergies would go away.
Maybe. There's no blind test evidence of the whole thing. Like a lot of things, bees they're wonderful insects, and a lot is ascribed to them. Very little medically has been proven about them. There's a feeling that that beekeepers don't get rheumatoid arthritis. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. There's also, my wife has witnessed people getting a beekeeper coming into a hospital and giving MS patients bee stings on their back. Whether that's proven or not, I don't know. Women buy cosmetics that have royal jelly in them. The only thing royal about them is the name, but they seem to be impressed by the cosmetic possibilities of something that's royal.
Honey has been used medicinally for thousands of years in the treatment of superficial infections. It's so hyperosmolar that bacteria can't really survive in that hyperosmolar environment.
Yes, in fact, that's a very good point. And honey has been discovered in Egyptian tombs that are thousands of years old, and it's still edible because of the low concentration of water. Yeasts and bacteria can't grow well in it.
I have a question. Given the importance of native bees in pollinating, how dangerous are African bees to our native bees?
I'd say that African bees are more dangerous to you than they are to your cattle or your dog or something like that than they are to the native bees. The bee problem, the bees, when Europeans brought honeybees to the United States or to the Western Hemisphere, they created competition with the native bees. And that's been going on forever and ever and ever. One thing I might mention also, there is a new threat to bees. And some of you may have read it. It's called the press has called it the murder wasp. Have you heard about that?
Yeah.
And it's a wasp that's called, its other name is the Asian wasp. in Latin, the Latin name is the mandarin wasp. And it's very much in China and Japan. It's recently been discovered in the Northwest. It's discovered in the state of Washington, parts of the state of Washington, and in British Columbia. And it's a wasp that has its found in the ground. It's about 3 inches long. It has a sting that is considered one of the worst, most painful stings of any insect in the whole world. And the other thing is that it attacks beehives, and it will, in overnight, it can destroy a complete hive. They eat bees, and they eat the larvae of the bees. They bite their heads off. The bees in the Western Hemisphere have not developed any protection against them, and they're considered a tremendous threat not only to people, but they're a tremendous threat to honeybees as well. So there's a very active process going on in both Canada and the United States in trying to get destroy all of the colonies that are there. This has happened only in about the last year or two.
Is the African bee dangerous because of the sting, or do they swarm people, or what? In other words, what makes them dangerous to people?
The thing that makes them dangerous to people is that how defensive they are. They will perceive you as a threat before a European honeybee does. So they will sting, they will start stinging much earlier with a much lower threshold to deciding that you are a threat, and they will sting in much larger numbers, and they will chase you much farther.
Do they die when they sting?
Yes. They're just like ordinary European honeybees. They just are nastier. It's
So
only
then do you then need multiple bees to affect you in that they die after the sting?
Yes. Most for an allergic person, one sting can kill you. For a non-allergic person, it generally takes usually more than 100 of them for some sort of systemic toxicological reaction.
Question.
But at that, I mean, one sting hurts. I generally, by the way, when I was a beekeeper, I would generally get about probably about 20 to 50 stings a season.
I just want to ask, were you involved at all in making Lexington a bee city?
No. And I haven't lived in Lexington for 20 years.
Oh.
I live in Bedford.
Oh.
Howard, when I see a beekeeper going to a hive and I think they're using what I perceive to be a smoke maker when they're working with the hives, what's that for? How does that work?
Okay, that's to sort of pacify the bees. When you smoke them, they sort of think that things are on fire, and they want to. They get ready to leave the hive, so they start eating honey, and they get fat and happy, and they're a lot more docile. So it's more to pacify them, so that they don't. They're less defensive then. Generally, we have smokers. What you'd usually do is a bunch of old leaves that you set on fire. Anyone else?
Well, once again, thank you, Howard. That was
Thank you very much.
good.
That was a wonderful opportunity.